This is an evolutionary adaptation that really helps explain, I think, why clients can also so quickly grasp the severity of something like a 54% spending reduction. And if we go back to that chart we just looked at, you can almost instantaneously see like, ooh, that's a very big, very steep decline. And you can pick that up with a HiMAV chart. While that same information presented numerically or as a report might fail to trigger any kind of equivalent emotional response. So visualization just bypasses that sort of analytical bottleneck of our working memory and allows our clients to simultaneously process multiple dimensions of a retirement strategy's performance. So we can see not only how frequent were cuts, perhaps, but how severe were cuts. And we can see those pretty much simultaneously in a way that would be very, very hard with any other sort of method. Hey everyone, real quick note, this comes from a presentation I did for Income Lab's Retirement Income Intel. It's a great webinar series for advisors who use Income Lab or people who may want to learn more about it. I've edited out some of the intros and whatnot just to keep this more streamlined, but just want to let you know in case you want to check out more of Income Lab's webinars. And with that, let's get started. Well, good morning everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to be talking about, as Justin mentioned, kind of a recent Kitz's post that really dove into this concept of historical market visualization and how I think that can really transform these kind of abstract financial concepts around retirement planning into much more tangible experiences that we can actually try to truly emotionally connect with clients around their plan and what they can expect. So this has actually been one of my favorite tools within Income Lab to use with clients when I get to the retirement stress test and how that works. And particularly during these turbulent times, I've had some very uncomfortable clients recently, and I'm really using this tool a lot. So looking forward to just diving a bit deeper into why I think these types of visualizations are so powerful. So in today's session, first we'll kind of introduce what historical market visualization is, or kind of HiMAV, as I've called it at least in that article, and explain what makes that different from traditional planning approaches. We'll then take a look at why conventional planning tools like Monte Carlo simulation, while perhaps mathematically sound, will often fail to really resonate with clients on kind of that emotional level. And then next, we'll look at how that visualization and narrative frameworks that we can tap into through something like the retirement stress test really, I think, allow our human brains to better naturally process that information. And we'll look at some practical examples of how we can actually use HiMAV in action through a case study and kind of walk through what that looks like. And then finally, just a few kind of implementation considerations to help bring these techniques together in your practice. And so by the end of the presentation, my hope is that you'll have a better sense of how to use this tool in an actual kind of concrete way to have some good conversations with clients and really emotionally connect a little bit better around a plan and ultimately give people more peace of mind. So for many advisors who are still going to heavily use something like Monte Carlo simulation, I think there is a bit of a paradox, right? The mathematical tools that are most commonly used today are often the very same tools that clients find the most difficult to understand and connect with emotionally. And when advisors present something like a Monte Carlo simulation, I think they're really using a tool that maybe, at least in theory, could shed some light into the overall risk in a client's plan. But those insights are actually really pretty meaningless if clients can't translate them into something tangible that they can actually imagine living through. And so to me, this disconnect isn't just a communication problem, right? It's actually a little bit deeper in that it's more of a cognitive one that's based on how just the human mind processes information. And so today, I think we're going to look at why a HiMAV type chart actually does it much better. So let's start it by just looking at kind of the tools that are most currently used in retirement planning. So obviously Monte Carlo simulation, that's a big one, heavily relied on in the industry today, generally showing somebody some sort of percentage of simulated outcomes in which the client will finish with assets remaining in their plan. Advisors might also do some sort of stress test with that or assess plan durability under kind of a handful of different adverse scenarios. But many of these tools do offer some advanced calculation capabilities or cash flow, tax planning, those types of things they might be able to handle better than most people could in a spreadsheet or just otherwise with kind of a straight line calculation. So there's some value in that, but I think they often really do fall short in helping clients actually connect these abstract numbers to their real lives. So when we tell a client that they have a 95% probability of success, like what does that actually mean and how will their retirement actually unfold? Will their income change? When will adjustments be needed? Will adjustments be needed? These are all questions that really don't get answered at all through traditional approaches. I think if we try and put ourselves in the client's shoes for a moment, most people, even those that are pretty financially sophisticated, do struggle to make confident decisions based on abstract statistical reasoning. So when presented with something like Monte Carlo results or probability of success figures, clients face this pretty significant cognitive challenge that they're facing, maybe also in the same time, that it's kind of a stressful conversation. But they need to try and translate these numbers on a page or on a screen in somebody's office into something that feels tangible and real, or something that they can actually kind of imagine living through if it's going to have the most impact. They'll really need to try and understand whether they might run out of money. That's ultimately the question we often have at the end of the day. But how their lifestyle, might be affected is also something that really gets ignored in most types of planning, right? What would market fluctuations do? Okay, maybe they didn't totally run out of money, but did they have to cut back a lot? What adjustments might they need to make? And generally, most traditional tools don't address this piece at all. And I think really leaves a big sense of worry on the client's perspective in terms of how they ought to proceed and how secure they really are. So consider what happens when we tell a client they have a 95% probability of success. This might sound impressive, but what does it actually tell them? And other than maybe this vague feeling of, well, 95%, that's pretty high. That's probably a good thing. Most people aren't going to have really any idea what that means for their actual retirement spending journey. Moreover, I think unless a client has fully annuitized their wealth or has a really strong preference to never adjust their spending, so they just always want to spend at the same level, maybe with inflation adjustments, this simple probability metric is just not going to convey anything that's actually useful if an adjustment is likely. And I think sometimes even advisors get tripped up a little bit here because when adjustments might be needed and when somebody's willing to make those adjustments, the results can look very different. In fact, in some of my own research using Income Lab in the past, we found that when planning to a constant 95% probability of success, downward adjustments actually would have been called for. So if somebody just said, I'm going to keep targeting 95%, going to stick at that level all the way through retirement. So they used it though on a dynamic basis over time, it actually would have called for downward adjustments in more than 96% of scenarios. So I think that disconnect is sometimes there. Sometimes we talk about 95% probability of success being like a 5% probability of adjustment, or at least people like Michael Kitces and myself have advocated as that might be an improvement, but that might actually be misunderstood as well, because really we're talking about 96% of scenarios actually needed to cut spending. And going beyond that, in 15% of cases, those adjustments would have been really significant. Some of them would have been small and fairly trivial, but we would have had large downward adjustments of at least 35% in 15% of those cases. So to me, that is a very meaningful disconnect when we think about how people actually use the tools. And none of this is at all clear by simply hearing 95% probability of success. So what is historical market visualization, or HiMAV? It's kind of a shorthand for that. At its core, it's really just a framework that involves backtesting a particular retirement income strategy using real-world historical data to assess how that strategy would have actually performed if it had been used in past markets. Now, in this article, we're really just putting a name, right? Income Lab's been doing this before anybody that I'm aware of in terms of actually having a tool that you can do that, but we're kind of trying to give it an actual framework here so we can call this the HiMAV, or historical market visualization. But by visualizing the results, the HiMAV will help retirees quickly and easily understand some key dynamics, such as income volatility. How is their income or their spending going to change as they go through retirement, as well as maybe changes in their portfolio balance. So what would have happened historically to an overall portfolio through time. And instead of modeling kind of a generic environment of, say, something like below average returns or above average inflation, advisors can actually show how the same dynamics would have played out during some known time period that clients may already be familiar with and have that lived experience or cultural memory, something like the Great Depression, stagflation era of the 1970s, global financial crisis. Right? These are all examples we can use, and they really ground these abstract financial concepts in these really much more concrete historical events that clients can actually relate to. So let's take a look at a concrete example of a HiMAV in action. So this chart shows how Guyton-Klinger guardrails, and if you're not familiar, this is just a popular retirement income strategy developed by Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger that looks specifically at a certain sort of framework around how you would adjust spending. We can look at how those would have performed during the stagflation era had it existed at the time, right? They developed this framework after stagflation, but if we backtest it and historically simulate it going through that time period, what would that actual income experience have been? And as you can see, the stagflation era would have been particularly rough for someone using this framework. Their inflation adjusted spending would have dropped by as much as 54% below the initial level, and only recovering back to its initial spending level right before the very end of the plan. So again, this is just meant to be an illustration of how this historical use of an actual strategy in a historical context, right? That's where we get the historic in HiMAV, and the visualization comes from presenting this historical spending experience in a way that's quickly and easily processed and interpreted by our human brains, right? So when a client sees a chart like this, they can immediately grasp the severity of a spending reduction in a way that abstract probabilities just simply can't convey. So one of the strengths, I think, of a HiMAV strategy is that it's entirely agnostic to any particular methodology used to develop a retirement income strategy. So a strategy could have spending adjustments triggered based on withdrawal rates, general risk levels, preset thresholds, market triggers, or any other method somebody might prefer. But you could still use this. We could still use some historical data that allows us to observe when spending adjustments would have been triggered. This agnosticism also doesn't just apply to the retirement income strategies. You could also extend it to the, say, analytical methods behind a strategy itself. So for something like risk-based guardrails, which obviously Income Lab we're a big fan of, there we could set a retiree's risk levels based off of Monte Carlo simulation, historical simulation, regime-based Monte Carlo, right? We can be flexible there in when we're trying to use some underlying model to look at whether a retiree's risk levels have risen or fallen enough to justify a spending adjustment. The other nice thing as well with risk-based guardrails is we can account for all those different income sources. So things like Social Security, pension income, any of that can get accounted for. But again, the key point here is just regardless of your preferred approach, HiMAV can help illustrate historical performance in a powerful way. Now, historical market visualization, when it comes to why does this actually work for humans in a sense, I think it's really leveraging the brain's really quite remarkable capacity for visual processing. So that's a system that evolved in our history to rapidly identify patterns, detect anomalies, and make quick assessments that were really crucial for our survival. So psychological research has consistently demonstrated that visual processing is extremely fast, activating the visual cortex to enable near instantaneous recognition of trends, comparisons, and outliers. This is in part because it's so crucial to our survival, right? If you think, somebody in our kind of ancestral environment seeing a snake, right, and reacting quickly to that can mean the matter of life and death, and ultimately their survival to pass on their genes to the next generation. One study did find that images could be comprehended in as little as 13 milliseconds of exposure. So this is an evolutionary adaptation that really helps explain, I think, why clients can also so quickly grasp the severity of something like a 54% spending reduction. And if we go back to that chart we just looked at, you can almost instantaneously see like, ooh, that's a very big, very steep decline. And you can pick that up with a HiMAV chart, while that same information presented numerically or as a report might fail to trigger any kind of equivalent emotional response. So visualization just bypasses that sort of analytical bottleneck of our working memory and allows our clients to simultaneously process multiple dimensions of a retirement strategy's performance. So we can see not only how frequent were cuts, perhaps, but how severe were cuts. And we can see those pretty much simultaneously in a way that would be very, very hard with any other sort of method. So let's compare these two approaches for when it comes to communicating information about retirement planning. On the one hand, we have traditional Monte Carlo simulation, which might tell a client that, say, their plan has 92% probability of success. If this is a very abstract statistic, it's going to require significant mental translation to try and understand what this means in real life. In fact, I would argue that even most advisors, as we've kind of noted, don't really have a great grasp on what 92% probability of success means if a client is willing to adjust their spending in retirement. And I don't say that as a criticism of advisors. I say that as an advisor myself who really just can't quite process that, right? To my brain, that's just not going to tell me what is this actual income experience like in retirement, because it doesn't convey that. And it's just hard as this very abstract measure to tell us. On the other hand, a HiMAV visualization is going to display exactly how spending patterns would have evolved through some specific historical period, like the Great Depression. So clients can immediately see spending adjustments, magnitude, and when they might have occurred. The Monte Carlo approach also requires, again, just this abstract reasoning to even interpret what the results are, while the HiMAV approach is really just using our kind of innate visual processing system to create this immediate understanding. So another crucial difference to me is just how much thinking or how much work our brains need to do to actually be able to see that. And I think that's a pretty profound psychological difference between this sort of abstract future probability and a really concrete historical outcome. And I think for clients, they can also find a lot of reassurance in being able to say, this strategy has already survived the worst markets of the past century. Right? That provides a lot of peace of mind in a way that this strategy has a 95% probability of success simply cannot match. So HiMAVs also have a nice advantage in that they make it easy to compare strategies against one another. So consider this example here, which compares risk-based guardrails, again, strategy that we like at Income Lab and that I prefer, to Guyton-Klinger guardrails during the Great Depression. So even before we understand what the gold and blue lines here represent, we can almost instantaneously process that the blue line dips much lower than the gold line. And upon checking the key, if we go to look at that, we do see that the gold line reflects a risk-based guardrail strategy, and the blue line represents the Guyton-Klinger guardrail strategy for an otherwise identical case study and a starting portfolio spending amount. So we can clearly see that one approach here required a 45% spending reduction, while the other only required an 8% spending reduction. And this kind of immediate comparative insight is difficult to get from just talking in terms of statistics alone. So really here, I think in short, HiMAVs, and they're going to transform this abstract financial concept into something that's immediately comprehensible and something that can even be quickly compared against another strategy in a way that's just very, very difficult to do otherwise. And while the visualization is one really powerful aspect of HiMAV, I think its historical context actually provides an equally important advantage, and that it allows us to use a narrative framework. So HiMAV transforms this numerical data into meaningful stories that clients can connect from their own experience and cultural memories. So we're essentially harnessing the psychological power of narrative, which is one of the most fundamental ways humans have made sense of the world around them throughout history. And when we present retirement planning through narrative frameworks built around this recognizable historical events, we're tapping into something that's deeply intuitive for our clients. So they don't just see numbers changing, but they see a story that's actually unfolding and then they can relate to and understand emotionally. So I think this narrative component makes many of the complex interrelationships between different economic factors much easier to actually comprehend. So let's explore 4 specific ways that narrative frameworks actually can enhance client understanding. First, HiMAVs are going to tie abstract concepts like sequence of return risk to tangible historical events. So this helps kind of transform this theoretical concern into a visual pattern of portfolio depletion and spending cuts. Second, they're going to transform data into stories with a natural sort of cause and effect relationship. So instead of simply showing that spending decreased during the 1970s, a HiMAV could illustrate why it decreased due to inflation eroding purchasing power. And third, HiMAVs are going to connect to these lived experiences and the cultural knowledge that people have. So for clients who live through a specific market period, this does create kind of a powerful connection to this autobiographical memory. But even for those who haven't lived through it, there's still cultural knowledge embedded in these historical examples. And finally, the historical narratives are going to highlight the complex interplay between multiple economic factors. So with a single visualization of something like 1970 stagflation period, we're going to simultaneously demonstrate the impact of high inflation, rising interest rates, and poor equity returns without requiring a separate explanation of each component. And I think when we do try to sometimes break these down individually and just make it, again, very abstract and hypothetical, it again becomes very hard to follow and conceptualize, unlike when we present something like this. And when we look at the actual psychological mechanisms behind narrative frameworks and what makes them particularly effective for client communication, I think the historical references really activate this sort of existing knowledge that somebody has rather than, again, pointing to this complex kind of probability assessment. So one is just much more useful than the other. And the historical reference points also create kind of powerful cognitive anchors that can improve retention. So clients may forget some specific Monte Carlo success probabilities within days, right? How well are people actually going to remember 89% probability of success? But they may remember for years something more general, like their strategy would have weathered the Great Recession with only minor spending adjustments. So research has consistently shown that information presented in a narrative form is retained much better than more abstract data. And narratives also create a form of what we might call almost a psychological transportation, where clients can mentally project themselves into the historical scenario. And this can dramatically increase their engagement, comprehension, and the likelihood that an informed decision making will actually result when we're having a conversation about market volatility, right? So, and this is one that I've mentioned I'm using a lot with clients right now, because as we've gone through some bumpy times in the market, to be able to remind them, we built their plan to go through the Great Depression, to go through the global financial crisis. And those were far worse situations, at least when they ultimately got to the bottom, than we were close to at all today. That has, I think, provided a lot of peace of mind for my clients. But let's take a look at an actual practical case study here to see how a HiMAV can help a client make a better retirement planning decision in terms of both just how they might feel about retirement, but also even selecting a strategy that might be right for them. So let's take a look at John here, who is 65 years old, currently retired, and lives in California. He has a $1 million portfolio in a traditional IRA, uses a 60-40 portfolio allocation, and he receives $4,000 of monthly Social Security income. Now, importantly, John is open to exploring a range of guardrail strategies, and he's going to look at things from more aggressive to more conservative approaches. So he is open to adjustment, and he's willing to consider different levels of adjustment. And his advisor wants to help him understand how these different strategies might affect his retirement experience. But again, presenting abstract probabilities alone isn't going to give John much tangible understanding. So this is where we can rely on historic market visualization. Now, before we dive into the actual case study, for any advisors here today who may not be really familiar with what risk-based guardrails are, I think it might be useful to first do a quick overview. Now, personally, I would not recommend using these guardrails levels, but I often give this example here just as a way that I think many advisors do apply this sort of maybe light form of guardrails somewhat intuitively, and how they use Monte Carlo simulation with clients on an ongoing basis. For instance, first, we might target an initial income that arrives at an initial probability of success of 90%. And so that's our initial target. Then from there, we might say if the probability of success gets too high, say 99%, then we might suggest increasing spending to move back to our target of 90%. Or if probability of success falls too low, say 70%, then we might recommend decreasing spending and bringing the planned probability of success level back to the target of 90%. Also, just a general note, I am using probability of success here just for communication purposes among advisors, but at Income Lab, we also prefer to kind of think of this a different way to really try and improve understanding and reduce the risk that somebody might misinterpret some of these numbers. But as I mentioned, I gave that previous example just as kind of an intuitive illustration of what somebody might use, but I'm not actually a fan of guardrails from that previous slide. And a big issue is actually that the lower guardrail being at 70% probability of success. And this might feel intuitive and comfortable to advisors, but this is an example of maybe how our own intuition may not align perfectly with how we ought to think about risk levels when planning in retirement on an ongoing basis. And this graphic here comes from a nice article from Justin Fitzpatrick on precisely this topic. And a big takeaway is that 50% probability of success, if we're planning on an ongoing basis and we're willing to make adjustments, is really more akin to our best guess for spending. And it sounds very scary to many people, but if we're willing to make adjustments, a 50% probability of success is actually our sort of middle of the road, most likely outcome. So that means risk hasn't actually gotten that high if we're deciding we're going to cut spending at 70%, and even all the way down to 50%, it's still not as high as most people think. And if we weren't making adjustments, of course, that would be a different situation, right? If you told me I had to choose one probability of success level, I can never run a plan again, we're going to play out my retirement, had to choose based off that, then I might want to aim for something much higher. But if we are going to make adjustments, we are going to plan dynamically, we don't have to just charge forward blindly, then this really shouldn't feel that scary. And in fact, many of the overreactions that could come by making spending adjustments, by adjusting before that probability of success level gets too low, actually are what caused things like the big divergence we saw in the Guyton-Klinger analysis of that strategy, where really you should be letting the probability of success fall to somewhere around 25%, in many cases before we're even thinking about making adjustments. And if we don't do that, we do tend to overreact and make adjustments when we didn't need to. And again, that's why the Guyton-Klinger dropped by 54%, was because it was making adjustments that ultimately wouldn't have needed to be made. And that's why the risk-based guardrails approach went through the same period, only by decreasing spending 8%. So I'd like to give that as a quick intro to what we see when we look at these conservative, moderate, aggressive types of levels. And this chart here shows the default risk levels in Income Lab. Note that we can choose anywhere from an aggressive to a conservative guardrails level. And what this is really doing is changing that initial target risk level. So you might think of something like a conservative strategy as targeting a 99% probability of success initially, while a more moderate strategy might be 80%, and maybe an aggressive strategy is targeting something like a 60% probability of success initially. And at least for purposes here and the defaults within Income Lab, also note the lower guardrail standard at 25% probability of success and the upper guardrail at 100% probability of success. And then we'll look specifically at this conservative, moderate, and aggressive scenario in the next slide. So getting back to John's case now, John's advisor presents him with 3 risk-based guardrail strategies. Conservative, with an initial spending of $7,410 and high probability of success, of course. Moderate, with an initial spending of $7,890. And aggressive, with an initial spending of $8,210. And remember, this is based off of, in this case, what would be a lower probability of success level, 60%, but still better than even what our best guess would be. So just seeing these initial options, John can understand, okay, there's some trade-offs here in terms of starting with income that is higher now, or more aggressive, versus having a lower risk of needing to reduce spending later or being more conservative. But these numbers alone don't really help John decide which approach best fits his needs and risk tolerance. It tells us where we start, but it doesn't provide any understanding of where we're going to go and what those adjustments over time might look like. So That's really a challenge for John, despite all of these short-term benefits of understanding the guardrails parameters. So the peace of mind that actually does come from knowing where is that lower guardrail where you make an adjustment. I think that's actually very big, that somebody can make it through tough times in the market and say, okay, I've got 1.2 million in my portfolio now, but I'm not even going to cut spending until it falls to 700,000. And if it gets to 700,000, I'm only going to cut spending by 500 a month. Right? If somebody knows that and they're comfortable with the 500 a month adjustment, that provides a lot of peace of mind in the short term. But in terms of long term, how's John here really supposed to know which strategy to choose? Which one is going to actually fit his best long-term preferences? Just seeing these initial spending values and probability figures really isn't going to be enough, right? The numbers alone are still too abstract and don't actually paint that long-term picture of how his spending might vary under each of these strategies. So I think this is just really a perfect example of that gap between still even those abstract numbers and the sort of lived experience that we discussed earlier that you can get from a HiMAV. So John needs to see the potential retirement journeys that he might be on and how those might differ, not just his first year of retirement. That's where our chart can come in, and now we can actually provide a little bit more insight there. So we can look and we can really help John better understand his options. His advisor could use a HiMAV chart, and he could compare how aggressive or conservative strategies might have performed starting right before the global financial crisis in November of 2007. So looking at this chart, we can see there were only slight differences in John's spending outcomes between the aggressive or blue and conservative or gold strategies. The more aggressive spending strategy started out with a higher spending rate, but it called for a cut going into the Great Recession. It was a very minor cut, but there's still a cut there. By contrast, the initial risk was so low with the more conservative strategy that John would have never hit his lower guardrail and wouldn't need to cut back his spending. And also, interestingly, despite the lower spending level at the beginning of a conservative plan, it does, in this case, actually eventually catch up in spending and surpasses the more aggressive guardrail strategy, at least for a short period of time in the middle of the plan, and then again in John's later years. Now, in addition to looking at how income changes over time, we can also assess how John's portfolio balances would have evolved. So this chart here shows us portfolio values over time for both strategies. So we can overlay them again with one another. It also includes the guardrails for the aggressive strategy. So in red and green, that is showing you the guardrails that have changed over time, but there it's just looking at the guardrails for the aggressive. But what's particularly illuminating about this is how the ongoing preference for current income over legacy, when you use that aggressive strategy, is actually going to lead to greater spend down of the portfolio. So whereas a conservative strategy is going to give greater preference to spending less and preserving a greater portfolio balance at any given point in time, an aggressive strategy gives greater preference to spending more and not preserving as much of the portfolio value. And at the end of this particular period, the aggressive strategy roughly maintains John's initial starting balance of $1 million. That's the one here in blue. Whereas the conservative strategy has actually appreciated to about $1.2 million, the line in gold. So this visualization does help John understand perhaps the long-term implications of each approach for both his spending and his legacy goals. Now, to give John an even better understanding of how these strategies might perform in different market environments, his advisor could also show him how they would have fared during, say, the stagflation era, starting in April of 1968. So this period was characterized by high inflation combined with economic stagnation. So that's a particularly challenging environment for retirees to be in. And as you can see in this chart, both strategies experienced spending adjustments during this difficult period, but the aggressive strategy, in the one in blue, required a more significant reduction. The conservative strategy provided more stable spending throughout. But again, by examining multiple periods like this, John can develop a much more nuanced understanding of how each strategy might perform under various economic conditions. And this can help him identify which one actually might best align with his goals and his preferences. And in my own experience, I would say I've found that many times you can see some stark differences if somebody's plan is particularly sensitive to inflation. So I'd say maybe in John's case, he doesn't have that risk, but if somebody was, say, particularly reliant on pension income or annuity income that's not inflation protected, then you could start to see where one scenario might look very good, but you look at the stagflation era, and then that can look very different. So let's look at one last period as well here, the Great Depression. Here we have the charts for both the spending and the portfolio balances. And this is showing that the more conservative strategy that John is considering would have performed beginning in April of 1929, just before the stock market crash that caused the Great Depression. But what's remarkable about this visualization, I think, is that despite retiring at this precarious moment in economic history, this strategy still would have performed quite well. During those initial devastating years of the Great Depression, while businesses were closing, banks were failing, spending would actually have increased above the initially planned amount. And this strategy detected opportunities to safely raise income several other times around 1930, 1933, 1937, and only one spending reduction would have been needed, and that came around 1949, nearly 20 years into retirement, but even then, the adjusted spending was significantly above what the initial planned amount would have been. So when presenting these historical visualizations to clients, I think advisors really can create powerful narratives to help their clients emotionally connect with the data. And for example, this actually comes directly from the Kitsis article here, so I'll take a look at an actual sort of script, but just as a hypothetical of how clients might talk through this and make this more resonating. So for example, the advisor might say, John, looking at this historical simulation, we can see something remarkable is happening. The scenario reflects retirement that began just before the Great Depression, arguably the most devastating economic time in modern American history. During this period, stock prices plummeted over 85%. From 1929 to 1931, employment soared 25% by 1933, and the economy experienced severe deflation, averaging negative 6.5% annually from 1930 to 1933. And many of us have parents or grandparents who lived through this era and whose lives were permanently shaped by the experience. Perhaps a grandmother who saved every piece of aluminum foil until her final days, or a grandfather who insisted on always maintaining a thoroughly stocked pantry with plenty of reserves, even decades after the hardship had passed. And these deeply ingrained habits reflect the psychological impact of living through a profound economic uncertainty. Yet, despite retiring at this really difficult moment, notice how this guardrail strategy performed. During those initial devastating years, while businesses were closing, banks were failing across the country, your spending plan would have actually increased above your initially planned amount. And this strategy detected opportunities to safely raise your income several times between 1930 and 1937. What's particularly striking is that even when accounting for inflation, this approach would have sustained your entire retirement with only one spending reduction occurring around 1949, nearly 20 years into retirement. And even then, your adjusted spending remained notably higher than your initial planned amount at the outset of retirement in 1929. Throughout this 25-year period, your portfolio balance gradually declined, but in a controlled manner that ensured lifetime sustainability. Right? So again, that's probably longer, wordier than I'd actually use with a client, but just going directly from the article, those are ways that you could put in some of that history and actually make it a little bit more real life for the client. And I think personally, even adding a note too about while we may plan for scenarios like the Great Depression because it represents this worst case historical scenario, most retirements are going to be far better. We're going to have far more favorable conditions. And in more typical environments, these guardrails would likely trigger more frequent and substantial spending increases, allowing our clients to enhance their life in very meaningful ways, whether that's additional travel, things they want to do, more time with family, increased support, charities and the cause they care about, or whatever is going to bring them the most fulfillment, right? There is a lot more upside often in a typical scenario. And you can even illustrate that by changing the period. So say having somebody retire during the global financial crisis rather than right before. But ultimately, I do think we can really kind of build on this by looking at multiple historical periods. I think that can help provide peace of mind about the resiliency that might be there in a plan. And different historical periods are going to highlight some different strengths and weaknesses of a given strategy. And as we noted, there might be periods or might be clients who are more sensitive to something like the inflation experienced during stagflation than they are just of a market decline that might be experienced like in the global financial crisis. So really bringing these all together, taking a look at these diverse yet understood periods in history can really paint a much more vivid picture for clients and help them understand what their risks actually are and what things they might actually want to do to identify that best portfolio and that best strategy for them in a way that, going back to where we started, you just can't do with a probability of success type plan. And while it's further in the weeds than I really want to get into today, I do want to note, of course, we can, especially with risk-based guardrails, be even further customized with any additional parameters that might suit an individual's preferences. So, for instance, advisors might want to adjust the speed at which adjustments occur when a guardrail is hit. So perhaps only moving partway back to a target rather than jumping all the way at once. And that can actually help smooth out volatility and reduce, again, those overreactions. Advisors might also want to implement spending floors to maintain some sort of essential expenses. Or maybe there's a client that knows they have a real spending ceiling, right? They're not going to be able to spend above a certain amount. And for other clients, particularly those that might follow more of a die with zero type approach, advisors might also want to vary what those upper and lower guardrail thresholds are to a better align with those spending goals, right? So if somebody really wants to follow that die with zero approach, they might want to trigger those spending increases sooner, understanding that does increase the risk of also getting future decreases, but helps address that need of not wanting to have a large portfolio at the end of their life. But ultimately, the real flexibility of the HiMAV framework is that it allows us to test any of these different parameter combinations and really find what that best fit is given a client's unique situation and their own preferences. And when it comes to actually implementing historical market visualization in your practice, of course, for those using Income Lab, it's built into the tool. It's very easy to use. Once you actually build out your guardrails plan, you have it right there and available to test and work through different scenarios and help figure out what that right strategy is for a client. And so while it can work with really any methodology, I think you will want to find a tool that matches your own approach. I think for me, that's risk-based guardrails. So Income Lab is a natural fit. But I really do find that when I work with clients, I may want to use different scenarios for clients of different ages or different experiences or even different concerns. Some clients might just connect better with one period than another. So let's say I have somebody that is particularly concerned about inflation. Right? That's the risk that they've just really gravitated to and are thinking about. That might be a case where, I want to put a little more emphasis on the stagflation scenario and what they could do there and how we could get some good outcomes for them. But ultimately, the goal is that we don't want to just show our clients some kind of pretty charts, but to really create this meaningful narrative that helps our clients truly understand and believe in whatever retirement strategy they end up going with. So as we kind of wrap up here today's session, I do still want to highlight 5 key takeaways. First, traditional retirement planning tools, while perhaps mathematically sound, often do fail to create this emotional connection and understanding for our clients. Second, historical market visualization does transform these abstract probabilities into a more visual narrative that I think clients can immediately grasp and process. Third, historical contexts make planning more relatable and tangible by anchoring these strategies in actual real-world events that clients may already be familiar with. Fourth, the combination of visualization and narrative frameworks together dramatically improves our client understanding and I think confidence in their retirement strategies. Finally, a HiMAV approach works with virtually any retirement income methodology, making it adaptable to whatever you might prefer at your practice. Now, Income Lab is really the only tool I'm aware of that does HiMAV today, but for any of those who might be here that do buy into a risk-based guardrails framework, it just makes it that much more powerful as a tool for having some good client conversations. And ultimately, the greatest value of historical market visualization is just in that ability to transform these retirement planning discussions from an abstract mathematical exercise into this really emotionally sort of resonant experience. And when clients can visualize how their chosen strategy would have performed during periods like the Great Depression, stagflation, global financial crisis, I think they gain more than just that intellectual understanding, but they really build some emotional resilience for future market volatility. And, retirement income planning, as much as statistics and math is a part of that, is not all about the math. It's really about helping our clients believe in their plan. And HiMAVs, to me, give clients a really powerful lens through which they view their strategy. Again, transforming these sort of abstract probabilities into these more lived, relatable experiences. And I think for me, that's why I've gravitated to, when I use Income Lab with my clients, this really is a big focal point. I'll introduce the guardrails, what they are, how they work, but then I'm pretty quickly moving into, okay, let's actually stress test these and see how they would work in some of the worst periods of history, and really trying to build more of that narrative and that connection, and hopefully that resilience for when we do come into these tougher times in the market, like we've had recently. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
All right. Thank you, Derek. That was great. Got a ton of questions, and there's a bunch that are kind of in one theme. So I'll ask them and maybe do some follow up. So there are reasons someone might feel there are pitfalls in doing historical backtesting. Do clients in your experience, pick that out and say, yeah, okay, that happened in the past, but what about the future? And how do you think personally about, just kind of those backtesting pitfalls?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly a fair criticism, right? We know the future will be different than the past. I tend to not get too worried when we do look at things like what the past entailed in terms of going through the world wars and things that we've seen. I think those are some for stress testing purposes. There's no guarantee the future couldn't be worse, but I think we are throwing some pretty rough things at a plan by doing that. And so I really haven't run into clients giving pushback. Of course, maybe they're not vocalizing it and telling me that, but I just haven't personally had anybody question that. And I've had some really good, powerful conversations, I'd say, around showing people those historical simulations.
Yeah, it's about like, these are things your point about that you can relate to it, especially if you've lived through it. But as you say, even historical memory, right? I mean, I was pretty young when gas prices were really high in the early 80s. So maybe I remember, maybe I don't, right? But like, I definitely remember hearing about it, or gas lines and things like that. So it's like, hey, we're going to run it through things we know can happen because they did happen, but that doesn't mean that's what you're going to experience in your life. On that point, again, probably not a thing clients even think about, but just to clarify what these back tests are, they are running this exact plan through a particular sequence of returns and inflation and having it do that adjustment. So several people pointed out that in the Great Depression, there was no Social Security. You might not have had, access to low-cost index funds. Like these things may not have actually been possible. Does that come out? And what are your thoughts on it?
I haven't had a client point that out. I mean, I am waiting for the time I might get a client that said, wait a minute, that Social Security wasn't around back then. How are you testing that? So it's a question I kind of anticipate I'll get, but I haven't gotten that. But just like you said, yeah, I mean, we're assuming that somebody is going through history with these cash flows, with these portfolio distributions that they desire. But we know that that's not actually what happened in reality. So you just have to be careful, I think, in how you kind of frame that. But for me, it doesn't take away from it. I mean, if Social Security had been around back then, that would have been a resource like somebody has today in their current plan.
Right. Okay. Man, lots of questions here. Let me see which ones we've got. Okay, so let's address this one. So regarding kind of, you mentioned it in terms of speed of adjustments, but also a question around frequency of adjustments and things like that. Can you address, if you're willing to adjust, how often you would generally see adjustments and how the settings really can translate into how often you see them?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just use the defaults in Income Lab unless I end up getting into a situation where, we really do need to plan around something. Like if somebody wants to put in a floor, they want to put in a ceiling. And part of that is there is the speed settings that are set in Income Lab in terms of how fast those adjustments would occur. They also help protect against that overreaction sort of effect. And so that's why I I just like to leave it as it is. I've looked, my own kind of testing and playing around with it. It seems to work pretty well for what I think my clients are looking for. I love that you have the control to go in and play with those, and maybe a client has a very unique sort of preference. And in that case, you could go in and you could change. I mean, just trying to think of cases where like maybe you'd want that speed to be faster, and you're maybe willing to like tolerate, okay, I could take a really big reduction in spending, knowing that that might not be what I needed to do. But, there's reasons why somebody might want to build in something faster. So
Yeah.
I like that I have the ability, but in practice, I don't find myself actually going in and tweaking those.
Yeah. And those defaults are set, they're not randomly set. They're there because they reflect general preferences of, so when you hit a lower guardrail, that's the take a pay cut guardrail. And there, people would typically prefer not to overreact, right? Okay, I could take a pay cut, but let's take the smallest one we think might be enough. And then we could do another one if we need to. So that's why the speed, quote unquote, is slower when you hit the lower guardrail. One question from early in your presentation when you were talking about if you had a plan where you were willing to adjust and sticking with a 95% probability of success, you actually end up adjusting almost always. In any scenario. I think that was a little bit confusing to some people, maybe because we hadn't introduced guardrails yet, but why is that?
Yep. And if you really think about it, nobody actually plans this way, right? That literally means you're setting 95% probability of success. You meet the client again next year or whatever you run, you solve for 95% probability of success. So if we had a down market, especially in those earlier years, that's when you would run into, anytime that happens, anytime the portfolio is down below where it started at, right, it's going to reduce how much you could spend. So it's going to call for a spending cut. Now, I would focus a little bit more on like the 15% of the time that cut was more than 35% in spending. Like, I think that's more meaningful rather than just all this noise that comes from the small increase, decrease that you'd experience. But that's what's really driving that, is that if you truly are updating it, planning to a constant 95% probability of success, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But that's going to be something that actually is very volatile in terms of how much you're spending.
We had another really good question about, well, what if someone is going to retire? Does this visualization and the software Income Lab recognize the portfolio losses sustained just before retiring? Is there a way to kind of align everything with that? And I mean, the answer is yes. Like, if you build a plan where there's a pre-retirement period, I mean, in principle, you could always do any kind of historical visualization. But the way that Income Lab does it is we tack on a pre-retirement period to where you're trying to start your simulation. So, and actually, even in each scenario, you can do before, during, or after so Great Depression, for example. You're actually starting when things are still decently good, or global financial crisis, you're starting in 07, not in the middle of 08, so that you're before, and typically before is the worst one. During probably felt the worst, but it actually ends up being pretty good because you're kind of starting at the bottom. And then after is kind of, pretty good too. So are you typically using the before scenarios, Derek?
Most of the time for the stress test. I do like to switch, often my kind of default go-to is the during global financial crisis, just to show like, okay, here's the upside that you could have in a typical plan as well, instead of being focused on the downside. But yep, mostly the before.
A question given, April was pretty volatile markets. Either with visualizations or even just with the guardrails, like in what way does that change how you talk with clients? You said you had some clients who might be having a rough time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been really nice to have that kind of touchstone of our guardrails plan to go back to, and the fact that I'd shown many of those clients the simulations before, shown them the stress test, and we'd actually talk through that. And so just to be able to have that as something to kind of remember, we've planned for this. We took a look at this. You didn't have to cut your spending, even if the market, fell, over 50% in the financial crisis, or 85% in the Great Depression. Those were scenarios somebody made it through without needing to cut their spending. And many times clients, oh, yeah, I remember, we took a look at that, and it just has been a nice, kind of like the touchstone to go back to and say, okay, yes, like we planned for this. This is not something that is out of the blue. And then, just in guardrails in general, when we're talking about, okay, here's your lower guardrail, right? That's where we'd be making the spending adjustment. And if we get there, are you comfortable with that? And for most of my clients, the answer is yes. They could cut back if they needed to. And I would say, okay, right, we'll address it if we get there. But we've already got our plan in place for when we make a spending adjustment. And until then, don't have to worry.
Man, there's a lot of great questions here. We are done. Maybe I'll sneak one last one in. How do clients respond to taking a pay cut or the idea of taking a pay cut?
I think that one is very client specific. I think most people find it pretty intuitive. They're like, yeah, if we go through a tough time in the market, maybe I would need to cut back. And so I don't get much pushback from that. But certainly the more you've got somebody who has very fixed expenses where they really feel like there's not much they could cut out, that's going to be the type of person that might have a little bit more unease with that. But I think that's all the more reason to have a good plan in place and plan ahead for that. If somebody really has expenses that can't be reduced, then make sure that they're starting out in a position that gives them the best chances in the long term.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Derek. That was a great presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us. Please fill out the survey at the end for your CE credits, and we'll see you all again next time. Thanks. Have a great day.